Geoffrey Chaucer was born in the 1340s in London, and he has been called the father of English literature, or the father of English poetry. He's best known as the author of the Canterbury Tales, but he also had a career as a bureaucrat, a diplomat, a courtier, and a member of parliament. He also wrote a number of things aside from the Canterbury Tales, which are not nearly as well known, including The Book of the Duchess, The House of Fame, The Legend of Good Women, and Troilus and Cressida. And he was also a translator. He translated from French and from Latin. From French, he translated The Romance of the Rose by Guillaume de Loris. And from Latin, he translated The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, at which we've looked on this podcast. And he also wrote a treatise on the astrolabe, which is a device that used to be used to make astronomical measurements and observations, but is now obsolete. He wrote a treatise on that device for his 10-year-old son. And while details about the life of the Gawain poet, who was the poet who wrote Sir Gawain in the Green Knight, at which we've also looked on this podcast, the details of his life are largely unknown. We don't even know his name. And he was living at the same time as Geoffrey Chaucer. He was believed to have been born in the latter part of the 14th century. We have a lot of detail about Chaucer's life, and that's to a great extent because of his work as a public servant. That is all very well documented, and there are almost 500 written items that are evidence of his career. So those who are interested can go into a lot more detail. We'll just touch briefly on some of the highlights. In 1357, and again, since we don't know exactly when Chaucer was born, we don't know exactly how old he was, but he was probably a teenager, he became a page to a noblewoman, Elizabeth de Burgh, the Countess of Ulster, who was married to Lionel of Antwerp, who was the second surviving son of the king, who was the great Edward III. And in 1359, in the early stages of the 100 Years' War, and that war was going on for the entirety of Chaucer's life. In 1359, Edward III invaded France, and Chaucer traveled with Lionel of Antwerp, Elizabeth's husband. He traveled as part of the English army, and in 1360 he was captured during the siege of Reims, which, by the way, is also the capital of the champagne-producing region of France. Maybe the English were just trying to get some bubbly. But Chaucer was captured during that siege, and Edward III paid £16 for his ransom, which is roughly equivalent to 12,000 pounds sterling in 2021, and Chaucer was released. That was a good amount at that time. Chaucer went on a number of diplomatic voyages. He went to Picardy, which is in France, and in 1373 he visited Genoa and Florence, which are, of course, in Italy. Some scholars think that on that trip he met with either Petrarch or Boccaccio, who would have introduced him to medieval Italian poetry. Boccaccio, at whom we've also looked on this podcast, is, of course, the author of the Decameron and On Famous Women. And Petrarch wrote a lot of sonnets and is also well known for having rediscovered the letters of Cicero, a significant contribution to the Renaissance, which was emerging out of Florence at that time. And in 1374, on St. George's Day, which was a day of celebration when artistic endeavors were usually rewarded, Edward III granted Chaucer, quote, a gallon of wine daily for the rest of his life, end quote. And it's not clear what he gave him this for, but because it was given on this particular day, and because it is such an unusual gift, a gallon of wine a day is a lot of wine. It's generally thought that this was a reward for some kind of poetic or artistic thing that Chaucer had done at that time. So this is some indication that he was writing at that time and was known for his writing, though he wouldn't start writing the Canterbury Tales, scholars think, until the early 1380s. He was also a close friend of John of Gaunt, who was wealthy and influential in the 100 Years' War, and was also the father of King Henry IV and the founder of the House of Lancaster, which would rule England from 1399 until the War of the Roses in the late 15th century. And Chaucer also served under John of Gaunt's patronage. In studying music, I remember being sort of disillusioned at a young age when I learned that most composers, pretty much all of them, served some monarch, or they had some rich patron to help to fund their artistic work, because that somehow seemed too worldly, too human, that you needed to work for some guy and do what he wants. And this is true of visual artists too, of the past, that they were often connected to the rich people of their society. And doing this artistic work at the behest or the mercy of some wealthy patron seemed at first to me to cheapen it somehow. And it also possibly suggested that the people who are remembered are not necessarily the ones who should be remembered, they're just the ones who got hooked up to a patron. And there certainly might be something of that. That's why when we look at old books, you could unknowingly be praising something that doesn't necessarily have any artistic merit. It's just the equivalent of a BMW for some Austrian count or something. But hopefully, in part, the filter of time has removed some of those from the canon, though of course we can't always be sure. There might be things that are considered canon that ought not to be there, as well as things that aren't canon that possibly should. And that's part of why I'm interested in this project of reading the works of the canon to try to decide, if just for myself, what I think should be there and shouldn't. And the modern version of this in the last 150 years or so is writers getting picked up by a publisher or not. There are all kinds of famous stories about how, for example, Moby Dick was rejected many times before it was published. But the second part of the reason why a young person, or perhaps anyone, would prefer not to think about how artists are often connected to some kind of patron has to do with the concern that it was some kind of social connection that ended up shaping a part of our culture. The first part is related but different. We don't like to think of an artist or a writer or a composer as being so dependent on somebody. We want to think of their work and of themselves as standing independently. And on one level, we simply have to let that go as a fiction, because even a modern artist whose art sells a lot, either a musician or a visual artist, they are still beholden to the public as their patron. So they also are not completely independent. And the irony is that it's possible, if history is any indication, that having the art production centered on the elite of society, as it basically was until the 20th century, might result in better art. And that when you make art democratic and you have artists catering to the middle of the bell curve, the quality of the art drops. But the other thing is that in either situation, whether an artist is painting a portrait of a duke or trying to write a song that people can listen to while they're doing their 9-to-5 job and they don't have to stop and give it their full attention, in either case, the artist is not fully dependent on their patron. Even though the patron is paying the money, if it's a skilled artist, if he has some kind of falling out with his patron, if he's built up any kind of a reputation, he could probably find patronage somewhere else. And the same thing is true for modern times. If you alienate your old audience in some way, you may be able to gain a new one, though in both cases, it will take some work. It's more comfortable to just stay where you are. But so, Chaucer's patron was John of Gaunt, and Chaucer died in 1400 in London, and he was the first writer to be buried in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. And Poets' Corner is the southern transept of Westminster Abbey, and he now rests there alongside Charles Dickens, George Friedrich Handel, Samuel Johnson, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, Edmund Spenser, Alfred Lloyd Tennyson, Thomas Macaulay, John Dryden, and many others. And the text that we're going to be looking at today is the Canterbury Tales, which, like the Decameron by Boccaccio, at which we've looked at, is also a frame story about people telling stories. In the case of the Canterbury Tales, it's a bunch of pilgrims who are traveling from London to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral in Canterbury. And the idea is that the pilgrimage would then go on to Jerusalem, though they never even get to Canterbury. And the concept is that while they're making this pilgrimage, they all have to tell each other stories in order to pass the time. It's generally thought that the Canterbury Tales are probably unfinished. In the prologue, about 30 pilgrims are introduced, and it's explained that each pilgrim will tell 4 stories, 2 on the way there and 2 on the way back, which would mean about 120 stories, whereas in its current form, the Canterbury Tales has 24 stories. There is no consensus about the order in which Chaucer meant for these stories to be told, and some scholars like to point out how these characters are on a pilgrimage similar to how Dante and Virgil were on a kind of pilgrimage into hell in the Divine Comedy, though the comparison to the Decameron is much stronger. There are a number of stories that are told in both. The Decameron, of course, was published before the Canterbury Tales, and as we mentioned, Chaucer might have even met Boccaccio. And you also have this dynamic where the characters in the story are also the audience to it. So you are reading the story as an audience member, but also the characters in the story are reacting to it too. And that's true both in the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales. And interestingly, both also end with a kind of apology. Boccaccio doesn't completely apologize. In fact, he defends himself and explains why he wrote what he wrote, whereas Chaucer, and we'll get to it, may be more penitent than that. We've talked about how Chaucer was close to Edward III, who during his reign emphasized the values of chivalry, and chivalry comes through quite strongly in the Canterbury Tales. And the Canterbury Tales also mention Lollardy, an early English religious movement led by John Wycliffe. And keep in mind that the Reformation would not begin for another century and a half, but he puts in some winks at current events from the time. It is also among the first English literary works to mention paper, which at the time was a relatively new invention and allowed for the dissemination of the written word on a scale that England had never seen before. And the Canterbury Tales, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and anything else written in English in the 14th century, was written in what we now call Middle English, which, if you read the Middle English of Chaucer, if you read the original text as a native English speaker, you can understand a lot of it. It would be a task to read it all the way through in the original Middle English, and you would certainly want to have a dictionary or an edition that translated a lot of the words, though I've seen editions like that. But it's pleasant to see how little English has changed in 6.5 centuries. And it's also interesting to see how there are many modern words that are the same, but their spelling has changed for whatever reason. As for meter, Chaucer uses the same meter throughout almost all of the tales. And the meter, of course, would refer to the original Middle English. The meter usually isn't maintained perfectly in translation. And even in the original, Chaucer sometimes writes in prose. He's generally thought of as the writer who brought iambic pentameter into English. And iambic pentameter is 10 syllables, 5 stressed, 5 unstressed. And blank verse, which is generally non-rhyming iambic pentameter, is the most common form of English poetry. And apparently 3/4 of all poetry written in English are written in blank verse. So iambic pentameter is a very common meter used in English poetry. And it has a nice sound that can keep you going for a long time. It doesn't grate on the ear. And just as an example, in case you don't know what it sounds like, here's a couple lines of iambic pentameter. A sentence written just to make a point and show you guys a certain kind of meter. So if you hear that, it's 2 lines of 5 stressed and unstressed syllables. And much of the Canterbury Tales is written basically in that meter. And one thing that often comes to mind when people think of the Canterbury Tales is the beautiful medieval editions of this poem that were prepared at the time. And 2 relatively well-known examples are the Hengwert and Ellesmere manuscripts. Apparently there are more copies of the Canterbury Tales than almost any other poem of the day, which makes some scholars think of it as a kind of medieval bestseller. And the stories of its publication gives us some examples of how a literary work was sometimes disseminated in the early 15th century. The Ellesmere manuscript is from that time, and it is what is called illuminated. Today we would roughly say that it's illustrated, and it's owned by the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. If you have in your mind pictures of the Canterbury Tales in nice Gothic blackletter writing with some nice medieval pictures in it, you're probably thinking of the Ellesmere manuscript. And it's a pride and an honor for an American library to be housing such an important document, and I hope that they're taking very good care of it. But it does make me wonder why this critical piece of English literary history is in California and not in London. And I don't mean that English and American history are so separated. They're, of course, closely linked, and a huge number of the people living in the United States have English heritage. So it's not completely out of place that we have it, but it somehow seems suitable that it would be in a library in London somewhere, since after all, that's where Chaucer lived basically his entire life. But that's not a big deal one way or the other. Now, the oldest one that's still available is called the Hengwart. Technically, it's called the MS Penier 392D, but that's a mouthful. And even that one was written by a scribe shortly after Chaucer's death. So, unfortunately, we don't have a manuscript that was written in Chaucer's hand. And about 75 years after Chaucer died, in 1475, William Caxton, who was the guy who brought this new device, the printing press, to England. Remember, Johannes Gutenberg was working sometime in the 1430s or the 1440s to develop the printing press, and then it spread across Europe, and it got to England with William Caxton in about 1475. And the Canterbury Tales was one of the books that Caxton chose to be among the first writings printed using this new machine in England. Then later, in the late 15th and into the 16th century, there was a guy named Richard Pynson. And I have to point out how similar this name Pynson, Pynson, is to the name Pynchon, Pynchon, which if you go and listen to our discussion of the House of the Seven Gables, we talk about this significant English and American family that has a number of literary connections. And this is based on nothing but my experience with how names can change over time and a little intuition. But my unfounded theory is that this guy, Richard Pynson, is somehow connected to the family that we later came to call the Pynchon family. But anyway, that's not the point about him. He was born in Normandy in France. He then moved to London, and he became one of the leading printers in England in the generation following William Caxton. He was the king's printer for Henry VII, and for Henry VIII, he had the same role for about 20 years, and he was responsible for printing and publishing much official legal material. He printed a lot of books, including the first English cookbook and the first book to use Roman type, and he also printed an illustrated version of the Canterbury Tales. And he was also the first to collect and sell something that resembled a kind of collected works of Chaucer. But as he was doing that, he pulled in some things that it later was found out that they weren't Chaucer. And so then William Tynn, who was an English courtier around that time, after having spent years comparing different versions of Chaucer's writings, he picked 41 pieces to be published in 1532. And while there was still some discussion and doubt over the authorship of some of the writing, this is the first comprehensive view of Chaucer's work as a whole, and he published it again in 1542. And Tynn's edition still had some misattributed writings in it, but it was a step toward our understanding of a collection of Chaucer's works. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, Chaucer was printed more than any other English author, and he was the first author to have his writings pulled together in this kind of edition, this collected works of so-and-so type of edition. And some scholars think that these 16th century editions of Chaucer's collected works set the precedent for all other English authors in terms of having this kind of prestige where all of your writing is pulled together in one place and it's seen as valuable in a collection. And one of the things that's often said about Chaucer is that the Canterbury Tales brought the English vernacular, the English language, into literature. It made it a literary language in a way that it had not been before, in a way that literature was thought to be only written in French and Latin. And Italian had only recently joined that club as a result of the work of Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, to a lesser extent Guido Cavalcanti. But the idea is that Chaucer did for English what these other guys did for Italian. And some scholars point out that there were other men at the same time, John Gower, William Langland, Julian of Norwich, the Gawain poet, who were doing the same thing, and Chaucer was part of a movement. And that historically seems to be true, except that Chaucer was the guy who became very famous doing it. He didn't just write poetry in English, he wrote poetry in English that very effectively captured the imagination of the ruling and the educated class at the time. And so then thereafter, you have Thomas Malory in the 15th century. In the 16th century, of course, it explodes. You have Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Edmund Spenser. And by the 17th century, you have Milton, and the rest is history. And so probably the most accurate way to think about this is that toward literature in English at the time, and a lot of people were working on it, but Chaucer was the best connected politically and also perhaps the most capable. It would be incorrect to think that he just had this lightning bolt idea, hey, I'm going to write poetry in English, and he was the first guy to do it, and everybody afterwards said, that's amazing, let's all do that too. There was a general push in this direction, and he broke through. And it may be a result in part of the work of Thomas Hoccleve, who was a poet himself and really admired Chaucer and read his stuff a lot, and he actively promoted this idea that Chaucer is the father of English literature. So that too may have contributed to the spread of that meme. And now we can get into some passages. One of the fun things about reading Chaucer is the jokes that are hidden in his verses, and it's very easy to miss them. For example, one point to illustrate how if you do evil, you get evil in return, he writes, quote, "The devil sows and then the devil reaps, a shit-smeared shepherd and an honest sheep," end quote. And that portion of the tales is not about a shepherd. This is a side metaphor that he gives, but that's a colorful description of somebody who does something evil and gets something bad in return for it. But they're often quite philosophical as well. In another part he writes, quote, "We stagger through life as drunk as any mouse. A drunk man knows for sure he has a house, but how to get there proves to be the problem. For all roads slide away from drunken men. And that is certainly the way we live. We hurry after happiness and often see too late that everything's gone wrong. So everyone can say, and especially me who fancied happiness, would follow freedom, believing that if somehow I made my escape, I'd live in joy and perfect peace. But fate, in fact, has exiled me from all my bliss, and now I cannot see the face I miss more than freedom, and nothing can help me in this." End quote. Later, in a comment on people spying on each other, but that can easily be applied to the context of state surveillance, Chaucer writes, quote, "But the proverb says, and has said it for many years, fields have eyes to see with, and trees have ears. A man must keep himself forever steady, for things will always happen. You must be ready." End quote. And in an abrupt warning about getting caught up in the abstract and losing track of the concrete, he writes, quote, "Ignorant men are truly blessed, believing only what they believe and knowing what they know. It happened to another cleric, this astronomy. He always walked in the fields, trying to see in stars whatever the future might hold for our kind, until he fell in a clay pit, and then he died." End quote. So while he's looking up at the stars, trying to see the future, he falls in a clay pit and dies. And later he writes, quote, "Men can kill themselves with imagination. So hard and deep and dangerously we feel." End quote. Later he writes, quote, "We live and die on earth, languish for lack of certain knowledge, clearer than glass if we could read it, and know what's coming to pass." End quote. That's something that I think about. What is the knowledge that we languish for lack of that is clearer than glass if we could read it? The information is there. It's right there in front of us. But scientifically, mathematically, whatever it might be, we can't read it yet. But if we could, we might know what's coming to pass. And he skips over a long description of a wedding by saying, quote, "Myself, I do not care for stories that mix too much of chaff and straw along with their wheat. As if you cared, I don't, what nobles were seen at the marriage, or what was eaten first, what next, or who was blowing a trumpet and who a horn. The only way to describe a wedding is to say they ate, they drank, they danced, they sang, they played." End quote. The tales mention Seneca, Cicero, Boethius, Hercules, some other classical writers and figures. So Chaucer was reasonably well read in that area. And this next passage has a little social commentary, but it's also interesting because it mentions elves. And we often imagine elves and dragons and dwarves to be part of a genre that we call fantasy literature. We think of The Lord of the Rings and books and movies like that, and we think that it's something that some guys made up to tell stories. And they are that, certainly. But the question is when. And it's important to remember that Elves and other components of what we today call fantasy literature are a part of European folklore, and in some cases a part of European pre-Christian religion and mythology. So those were not made up in the 20th century. They were made up probably in some number of centuries BC in the mists of time that we can't see into. But here's a much more recent example of an author mentioning elves, though it's still 6.5 centuries ago. Quote, "In ancient times, in the days of good King Arthur, of whom the British speak with grateful honor, all this land of ours was filled with fairies. The elf queen, with her jolly company, was often seen dancing in soft green meadows. That, at least, was the old account I've read, and I speak, of course, of hundreds of years ago. But now these elves are not to be found anymore. Since these days, higher charity and prayers by friar beggars and other holy friars, searching every land and every stream, are thick as dust motes speckled in the beams of sunshine, blessing halls and kitchens and bowers, cities, townships, castles, even high towers, villages and barns, ships and dairies, and this explains the absence of our fairies. For where we used to see a strolling elf, a friar beggar now will walk himself equally in afternoons and mornings, selling ritual prayers and holy things as he goes walking through the lands allowed him. Now women may go safely up and down, in every bush or under every tree. There is no other demon now but he, and he's no rapist. All he does is dishonor." End quote. So he's saying there aren't any more fairies and elves in England because now there are friar beggars providing higher charity and prayers. So somehow the friar beggars, whom he criticizes, have replaced the fairies and elves. And while these stories, like the Decameron, are sometimes a little salacious, at other times Chaucer is very concerned with virtue. And remember, he wrote these stories over the last 15 years of his life, so they do have a variety of different kinds of thought in them. At one point he writes, quote, "But since you mention the noble line you're heir to, descended out of riches down the years, your words should come from the hearts of gentlemen. Such arrogance is really not worth a hen. Whoever is truly a man of virtue, whether in public or private, should always strive to be better and do whatever noble deeds he can. No one but he should be thought a gentleman. Nobility, says the Lord, should be based on our souls, not claimed because of what our fathers owned." End quote. And later along similar lines he writes, quote, "Carry fire to the very darkest house from here to the far-off mountains of Caucasus, then shut the doors and leave. The fire will go on, blazing and burning just as high and hot as if some thousands of men were there to watch it. What nature gives it to do, the fire will go on doing. I swear by my life until it's gone." End quote. And that's already interesting, talking about how what fire does, it does whether anyone is watching it or not. It just does what it does. So he's giving fire as an example to follow. And he goes on, quote, "Thus you may see with crystal clarity that nobleness is not attached to money, for people plainly do not always act the same as fire does, and these are facts. God knows we sometimes see a nobleman's son steeped in shame, behavior infamous. He who celebrates nobility that he was born to in a noble line, where every man was noble, true, refined, but won't behave as noble men must be, and as his fathers lived in nobility, he is not noble, although he bears a title. Ignoble deeds turn noblemen to triflers. Nobility you claim because your fathers had it, earned by constant goodness and other virtues, isn't yours if you have not lived it. This is a blessing that only God can give. He is the source of nobility by grace. There's no connection to titles, place, or station. Remember, as old Valerius tells us, how gracious Cicero made himself, born to no station, rising from poverty to noble high place. Read Seneca, and also Boethius, and find expressly framed this simple truth. A man is noble who behaves with virtue. And so, dear husband, the lesson must be learned, although my fathers were nothing, poor, unlearned. High God may grant me, I hope, a noble state, because my life is virtuous by his grace. A man becomes a noble when he begins to live his life in virtue and gives up sin. And as for your assertion that being poor I must be nothing, God himself for sure chose to live his life in poverty. And every man and girl, wife and widow can comprehend that Jesus would not live a vicious life, for he is heaven's king. Happy poverty is an honorable thing, as Seneca and many clerics have said. A poor man satisfied, his days not sad, to me is rich, although he does not own the shirt on his back. A greedy man has a soul of poverty, wanting what isn't his. But a man with nothing, who wants no more than he has, is rich, although you call him a dirty slave. Poverty that's honest sings its own song, as Juvenal cheerily says, and he's not wrong. The poor man merrily going on his way, surrounded by thieves, can sing and dance and play. Not that poverty is good, it's hateful, piling care and woe on a poor man's back. but poverty can also cure a lack of wisdom for one who lives it in calm and peace. Wretched as it is, no one will steal it. No one will fight to have it. No law will repeal it. And poverty, although it knocks you over, can help you know yourself and God's great love. It works like a pair of glasses and lets you see how many friends are true, how many will grieve you. And so, sir, since I haven't brought you grief, I ask you on this subject to hold your peace." End quote. And he talks about a few different things there, but one thing to touch on is that when you're younger, when you're a little kid or a teenager or even a young adult, and you hear a word like virtue, it sounds like something your teachers are telling you to do or your parents or something, and that it's sort of tiresome somehow. Maybe that it's kind of boring, but something you gradually learn through experience and something that I think all the religions understand. And by the way, he mentions God a lot. Chaucer mentions God, but you don't have to be religious to enjoy Chaucer. But something that you come to know as you get older is that leading a virtuous life, however you frame that, whether you talk about virtue or you talk about sin, and I view vice as a kind of secular word for sin, and it's the opposite of virtue. What you come to learn is that it's more difficult to live a virtuous life. It's more difficult to choose honesty and goodness and self-control than to exchange some portion of your integrity for some amount of social status. The world has a standing offer that if you're willing to give up some of your integrity, you can ascend in your social status. And it's more difficult to resist that than to submit to it. So if you find yourself rolling your eyes when a writer is talking about virtue and vice, or if a religious writer is talking about sin, I would encourage you to think about how that's not an outdated, boring way of looking at the world. That's as relevant as it's ever been, and you should stand sentinel over your life and your actions in order to avoid making that exchange. And without giving too much away on this next one, I'll just say that these two guys are traveling and talking about how they swindle people in their given professions. And one guy says, quote, "The same," the summoner said. "For me too. That's how it is. I take what I can, I do. Unless it's maybe too heavy or even too hot. Whatever I can squeeze in daylight or darkness, I worry no more for conscience than a fox or a shark. Without extortion, indeed, I'd surely be dead. And I never confess these sins," he proudly said. "I can't be bothered with conscience or compassion. The devil with these priestly father confessors. We're well met, I say, by God and St. James. And now, dear brother, I wish you'd tell me your name," the summoner said. And then the groom began to smile, a slow and sober, dangerous grin. "Brother," he said, "do you really want me to tell? I am a devil, and the place I live in is hell. On earth I ride about looking for business, searching for men who'll give me what's in their interest. All my profit depends upon this income, and you are riding about for this same reason, to get what you can no matter person or season. I do exactly the same, for I would go to the end of the earth to catch myself a soul." "Ah," this summoner said, "God bless me, really? To me you seemed a groom, really and truly. You looked exactly like a man like me. Have you some regular shape, a body you use in hell when you are doing whatever you do?" "Certainly not," he said. "Why would we ever need a body? But we take on whatever shape we like, or make you believe we're human, or like an ape. And we can even assume an angel's shape and use it here in this world. It's neither marvelous nor even absurd. A lousy juggler can make your head go spinning, and really, if he and I competed, I'd win. But why not pick yourself a regular shape, so whether you ride or walk you'll look the same? We have a purpose," he said. "We change our shape to whatever helps us most in catching prey." End quote. So this guy meets a devil in the shape of a man, and I don't know if it comes through when you're reading an excerpt, but when you're reading that story about these two guys talking about how they scam people, and then suddenly it takes this turn, it's very effective. And one of the dynamics of the Canterbury Tales is that the different pilgrims are competing with each other in telling stories about each other's professions. So one guy will tell a story where the protagonist is of a certain profession and he's made to look like a fool, and then another pilgrim who has that profession will tell a story in which the profession of the first guy is made to look like a fool or immoral or something. So one of the pilgrims is taking a swing at friars, and he says, quote, "This friar boasts how much he knows of hell. By God, that's no surprise, no one will wonder, for friars and fiends are harder to tear asunder. Please pardon me, I'm sure you've heard men tell how once a friar's spirit was swept to hell in a nighttime vision, where he was led about by an angel, carefully taking him up and down, showing tormented souls both burning and bound. Wherever the friar looked, no friars were found, though plenty of people met suffering and woe, and so he asked the angel to tell him more. 'Sir,' he said, 'do friars have such grace that none of them are ever seen in this place?' 'Oh yes,' said the angel, 'friars are here by the million, And then he led him to where huge Satan was lying. You see, he said, that Satan has a tail broader across than a tall ship's flapping sail. Lift up your tail, you Satan there, said he. Open up your ass so this friar can see the friar's nest and where it's kept in this place. In less than a minute, so quickly they came passing like buzzing bees swarming from a hive. 20,000 friars came tumbling, driving out of the hole in Satan's enormous ass, running all over hell, then just as fast as they'd been rushing out, came hurrying back and crept the whole great lot up into his ass. Satan slapped down his tail and again lay still. This friar, after seeing more than his fill of horrible pain and torments in this sorry place, found his spirit restored by God's great grace and inhabiting his body. He quickly awoke. But all the same, he lay there trembling. He shook with fear of the devil's ass, for it burned in his mind that this was the destination of all his kind. End quote. So that almost seems like a parody of the Divine Comedy. An angel shows a friar in a dream that all of the friars in hell are in the devil's butthole. In a more serious passage, he writes, quote, I warn you again. Stay on the watch for secret serpents your own weak heart may hatch. For creatures like that can creep beneath the grass and they will sting you without your knowledge, alas. End quote. Secret serpents your own weak heart may hatch. In that case, he's talking about anger and jealousy in a guy who's going to kill his wife. But that's a phrase worth thinking about for a lot of context. And this next one is a nice passage, wives and marriage and your love for your wife. He writes, quote, a wife is ruler of domestic economy. A man who's sick in bed must wail and weep if he has no wife to hold his house in her keeping. Let me warn you, if you want to follow wisdom, love your wife as Jesus loved his kingdom. If you truly love yourself, then love your wife. No man hates his family, but all his life keeps nourishing it along, so love your wife as part of you, in each and every day. Husband and wife together, wise folk say, is the road to follow, clerical folk aside. So closely joined that no disaster pries them apart, and especially the wife upholds them. End quote. And another short one here about the dangers of deception, of being deceived. Quote, a man's as good as blind when he's deceived. Deception is blindness, even for him who sees. End quote. And later about vice, he writes, quote, nothing gets cast away that might make passage through the gullet soft and smooth. The sauce is spiced by leaves and bark and roots and turned into a thing of great delight, to give the glutton a stronger appetite, but certainly indulgence in such rites is fatal. Men are dead who live in vice. End quote. About folly, he says, quote, the basic characteristic of a fool is this. He is easily convinced that another man is dangerous, and just as trusting in his own goodness. End quote. And on the value of good friends, he writes, quote, men pay a great time to make high towers and great buildings which are laborious to build, and when they are completed, they are not worth straw unless they are manned by good friends, true and wise. End quote. And on laziness, he writes, quote, and he who is lazy and slow can never find the time to make money. There is a versifier who says that lazy man excuses himself in winter because of the great cold, and in summer by reason of the great heat. End quote. So a lazy person always has an excuse not to work. And there's a little bit of a mystery in the Canterbury Tales, which is that there's this one called the Parson's Tale, which, based on its prologue, Chaucer appears to have intended for it to be the last tale in the whole book, and it's the longest of all the tales, but it's neither a story nor a poem, but is rather a long essay, maybe a treatise on penance and virtue and sin and religion generally. And it also ends with what's called the retraction, which I'll read now. And this is the very end of the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer writes, quote, and now I pray that those who hear this little treatise or read it, that if there is anything in it that pleases them, they ought to thank our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom comes all intelligence and all goodness. And if there is anything that displeases them, I also beg them to ascribe it to the flaws of my ignorance and ineptitude, and not to my intention, which would have caused me to write better if I had had the skill. As our book says, everything that is written for and by means of our faith. And so I humbly beseech you by the mercy of God that you pray for Christ to have mercy on me and to forgive me my sins, and especially of my translations and other writings, which deal only with worldly vanities, which I have recalled and withdrawn, as, for example, the book Troilus and Cressida, and also the House of Fame, and the Legend of Good Women, and the Book of the Duchess, and the Parliament of Fowls, and the Canterbury Tales, which tend to be sinful, and the Book of the Lion, and any other books if I were able to recall them to my mind, and many a song and many a lecherous poem, so that Christ, because of his great mercy, may forgive me my sins. But for my translation of Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, and of other books of the lives of saints and books of prayers and homilies and morality and devotion, I thank our Lord Jesus Christ and his blissful mother, and all the saints in heaven, beseeching them that from now till my life's end they send me the grace to sorrow for my sins, and to be solicitous for my soul's eternal salvation, and that they grant me the grace of true penitence, confession, and complete performance of penance in this present life by means of the generous grace of him who is the King of kings and priest over all priests, and who redeemed us with his heart's precious blood, so that I may be one of those who are saved at the day of judgment." End quote. So one thing about that is that it's clearly written from the perspective of Chaucer. That's not the parson talking, that's Chaucer talking, because he's talking about the books that he's written. But then the question is it sincere? And to me, it seems sincere. That seems like toward the end of his life, Chaucer repented, having written all these things that were sinful in his view, and he disowned them. He says, "which I have recalled and withdrawn." And especially when you consider that the Canterbury Tales were unfinished when he died, it might have been that the Parson's Tale was going to be something else. He might have turned it into a different treatise and put this at the end of it, or he might have put it appropriately at the end of the Canterbury Tales and added more to it as a kind of rejection of his past life. But another interpretation that some scholars have is that this was a sort of advertisement for his other writings, in that he lists by name a lot of his writings. But he also calls them sinful, which might have attracted some readers, but in those days, that probably would have been pretty repellent. And at the same time, he owns his translation of Boethius, of The Consolation of Philosophy. So he liked that one, but he didn't like his other writings. Or that was his position if he meant this retraction literally. But this is really a question mark to put on the end of the Canterbury Tales. And that makes Chaucer more interesting, not less. Shows him to have been somebody who was both artistic and able to hold down a job. He was able to be a bureaucrat and a diplomat, and also write a lot of poetry and prose. And he was also innovative in his art. He pushed this boundary. He spoke Latin, but he chose to write in English, not in Latin. And he had this sense of humor and also an imagination so that he could make up these stories. And at the same time, whatever shape it took, he had a moral sense as well. His stories have debauchery in them, but either throughout his life or toward the end of his life, as shown not only in the retraction or in the Parson's Tale, but in the citations of Seneca, the translation of Boethius, the citations of Boethius in the Tales, we see that he had a strong moral sense as well. And separately, when I think about how English initially, for a long time, was not thought of as suitable for literature, for art, that real literature was done in Latin or French, that makes me even more proud of the amazing body of English literature that we now have, which basically started with Chaucer and his friends. And it makes me eager to try to contribute to that in some way. And because of the dominant position that English has now, we think of English as culturally hegemonic, as irreplaceable. And so any contribution to it is irrelevant because you're contributing to something that's already so vast. And it's important to remember that English literature did not always exist. 700 years ago, basically, it didn't exist. Certainly not in the rich form that exists today. And 700 years from now, it might not exist. It's not a guaranteed thing that it will continue. And so any contribution that people have, you write a poem, you write a short story, you write an essay, you write a book, you should do it seriously and carefully because you're contributing to something that matters. And that doesn't mean that it can't have jokes in it. Chaucer, of course, set the precedent for that, for something that can both have jokes in it and be serious. But it should be done thoughtfully and carefully and with awareness of the contributions of those writers of English that came before us, as well as those readers of English who will come after us and may read what you write, and they could be affected by it positively or negatively. A lot of people, when they're writing, or even just when they're speaking, they don't think that they can have much of an impact, so maybe they don't think about it very much. But your speech is heard by somebody, unless you're talking to yourself alone in a room, and your writing will likely be read by at least one person, even if it's your friend. And so you want to think carefully about how that's going to affect the culture, because the culture that results is the aggregation of every time that a meme is propagated in some way, even if it's just a tweet or you saying something to somebody, or if it's in a larger form like in a book. All of those small actions comprise the culture. And so we should be pushing the culture in a direction that we want it to go in. And Geoffrey Chaucer is one of the guys who introduced the idea that this could be done in English, which is the way that we do it today. So we can keep him in mind. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, valrathpublishing.com, and buy yourself a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I printed. I have it with original cover art, 97 footnotes throughout the book that explain some of the geographical, historical, literary references that she uses, some of her more obscure vocabulary. It has excellent print quality. I have it at a good price with free shipping. I'm very pleased with how it came out. Frankenstein is more relevant today than it was when it was first published over 200 years ago. It's a powerful warning about the dangers of technology and how easy it might be for us to build something that could destroy us. It's one of those books that every thinking person should read. If you haven't read it, you absolutely should order yourself a copy now and do so. If you have but you don't own a copy, you should get mine. It's very good. It's the one that I have in my library. If you have read it and you do own a copy, you should get it for a friend or a family member. It makes an excellent gift. Christmas is coming. And if you're listening to this after Christmas, then Christmas is still coming because the next Christmas is coming. You probably couldn't quite fit it in a stocking, but it still would make an excellent gift. It's good both for somebody who is used to reading old books, and it's also a good introduction to maybe a young person or an older person who's not so used to reading older books, but maybe is curious to try. It's very fast-paced. It has a lot of good discussion material. It's generally thought of as the origin of the entire genre of science fiction. And as a publisher, I have the advantage of only printing books that I believe in, that I think that you would benefit from and enjoy reading. And that's why I chose to start with Frankenstein. This isn't a situation where I have a job to sell a thing, and so I have to convince people to buy the thing that I have. I picked the thing that I wanted to sell because I believe in its value. I am, in a way, proselytizing for classic literature, and in a more immediate way, proselytizing for Frankenstein, because I truly believe that you will benefit from reading this book. So go over to my website. The link is in the description. I have it on Amazon also. You can get it there if that's more convenient. But do yourself and your bookshelf a favor. Go and get yourself a copy right now. I'll put it in the mail today. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.